This video is going to be about primers used in cartridges for ammunition. A cartridge is defined as a primer, which has parts to it, in some cases that you need to know about, propellant, and a projectile. The primer initiates the fire and heat and pressure to set off the propellant of whatever type that is then capable of propelling the projectile out of the weapon. A primer is named for various reasons the primer, and it's the primary initiator for it, but it's also, in many cases, a primary explosive, meaning it's a true explosive, not just something that burns. It doesn't just deflagrate, it detonates. Tiny amounts of this are used and are placed in, usually, metal reinforced little cups, or sometimes metal strips in the old days, to make it to where you had to hit them pretty hard to set them off, and then they would set off in an inordinately large explosion or charge compared to their volume or mass or gram weight. In the case of virtually all primers used in modern day ammunition, for various reasons, they're normally shaped by like a shallow metal cup, with a very small diameter to them normally. Now, they range in size from the largest one that is commonly in use, that's in quotes, by the way, that's got a lot of caveats, for the 50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge, or 50 BMG, all the way down to the smaller primer, or smallest primer, that's used for pistols. And intermediate sizes are used for shotguns and for rifles. But there's some mix and match. And also, it should be noted, a second kind of primer is the rimfire primer used in .22 caliber and other cartridges. This was much more widely used in the past, and it involves squeezing part of the casing tightly enough to set off the explosion. There are many, many versions of this, but the one that ended up being used most used the rim of the cartridge to be compressed or squeezed or crushed, and that's called rimfire. It's slightly less reliable than all of the others, literally virtually all of them, but it is the one that won out because of simplicity of manufacture. Now, from one level of complexity of just being literally a metal cup, a little dinky one, with a little bit of, like, painted on the inside, like somebody was using, nail polish, with a primary explosive, to the complexity on the right that you see for a shotgun primer. This is not the most complicated one, but this is the most commonly used. I will call it a complex primer. In the body of this object, we call a 209 shot shell primer, or just a 209 primer. We have a metal cup here, and the bottom of this is filled with a primer compound, which I'm not indicating in the diagram because it's already busy enough. Inside of this object here, this is called a battery cup, and it is shaped with a rim, straight walls, primarily straight walls, a tapered mouth. This represents a very tiny opening here that's a mouth. It's usually larger than that, but I made it tiny on purpose for emphasis. And this battery cup has almost all of the same characteristics that you would find in a cartridge. Now, a cartridge, again, has to have a primer at the base, which this does. It has to have a propellant, which is missing, and it has to have a projectile. However, if one were to glue very carefully the outer rim, the base rim of, let's say, a .22 caliber or 17 caliber pellet rifle pellet, or just a BB from a BB gun on it, it would have two of the components of being a cartridge. And legally speaking, the ATF and many others have ruled that if you take a 209 primer all by itself and just glue a pellet on it, you've created ammunition. And you're subject to rules and regulations about that, and possibly prosecution for manufacturing a dangerous, cartridge. But it's missing propellant. But again, some people sell primer-only and projectile-based cartridges, and the ATF has ruled those to be literally ammunition, even though it doesn't have propellant in it. Because the primer, being a quote-unquote high explosive, can be treated as a propellant. Now, this diagram has to get credit, is from Tom Serrato. He made this and all these measurements, which I've summarized here, November through December 2009 for Trap Shooter USA, issue number 4, page 50. Now, I'm going to point out that the base here is called the base diameter, a lot like a cartridge. The flange is very similar to the rim on a cartridge, and in the case of every other cartridge besides 22 rimfire, it's almost identical in principle. And this here, this big metal object that has a little point on it, that's actually called the anvil. There are many variations of it. This is the most common one I could find, and it is poorly rendered by me. Again, this has most of the characteristics that are included in primers, obviously, except most primers don't have a battery cup. There's a version of this where you have a metal object stuck into the battery cup, stuck into the primer cup that acts as the anvil. For those of you who don't know, the back of this is struck by a center fire firing pin, hitting it, and it presses the primer compound, again I didn't illustrate it, against this anvil. Now the anvil can be integrated into the cartridge, so you have a primer, it's either Berdan or Boxer, that has an integral anvil, or it doesn't. Now with the 209 primer, so named because this is almost always 0.209 inches, or 209 inches across, you have this primer inside of its own battery cup that provides an anvil. Now this is done because this is used for shotgun shells, which can have a base that can be made out of plastic, paper, or metal, or combination. It could be a brass base with a cork, or wrapped paper, or plastic integral base wad, which is what this squeezes into. Now, the dimensions of this are very specifically important. This is the reason I brought up Mr. Serrato's diagram. The flange thickness is approximately 0.02 to 0.03 inches. So if you were to make a recess into the back of a shotgun shell design you're doing, you would need to form that or drill it at 0.02 to 0.03 inches to make sure that it would recess it cleanly. Next thing is the diameter you'd have to use if you were making a shotgun shell has to match these. And the primer flange, or the rim diameter, we're going to call it for fun, is anywhere from 0.305 inches to 0.310 inches. Now, if you're not aware of it, that just means that you need to make it anywhere from 0.3 to 0.31 inches. So most shotgun shells are, surprise, surprise, 0.31 inches in diameter for that inset, unless they're trying to exclude other companies' primers. And you may have noticed these numbers are kind of rounding up and rounding down to either a metric or imperial standard drill bit size. Coinkadinkly. Now we get to the diameter of and depth of the primer pocket. The overall length for the primer is used here, and it's anywhere from 0.29 to 0.302 inches. So most primer pocket depths are about 0.29 or 0.30 or 0.3 inches deep. They just are. A little extra room is better than having not enough. Now the diameter of the hole that you would drill or form if you were making a primer pocket could be anywhere from 0.236 inches to 0.24 inches or 244 inches. Now, cartridges that are designed to take or tolerate any primer do a simple trick where they make a tapered opening. Now, the largest diameter it should have as your minimum diameter is 0.245, and that's very close to the same thing here, so you could just make them all 0.244 inches. But in practice, they're done from 0.24 to 0.241 or something, and that's about it for the whole depth, and tapered down slightly to, let's say, 0.244, which is the largest diameter for this. So you can make it 0.24 or 0.240, which is the most common standard. Again, companies make all sorts of them, and it can be as small as 0.23 something, depending on the depth and diameters. But the other trick is to just make it pliant. Again, this goes into the base wad of the cartridge, the shotgun shell's hole in the back. So they will make it on purpose, bordering on 0.24, make the depth 0.3 inches, and make it through a pliant, soft steel or brass, or have it be literally a plastic base wad so that they don't have to worry about this. It squeezes into place, and that ensures that it stays in. And yes, the flange or rim is to maintain a gas-tight seal. And all of this is based on using a primer. And as you notice from the numbers, none of them are as small as 0.209, so it's literally the little primer in here that's called the 209. Now, the larger primer you use for every other thing, like rifles and pistols, the larger primer that's used conventionally is 0.210. Literally 1/1000th of an inch larger. Now, it could be just that they're talking about the inner versus outer diameters, and they could be interchangeable, but that's not the subject of the video. That's what it's measured as when people look it up. And I didn't look up anybody measuring the actual real physical primer inside of a 209 shell. Probably 209, but it could be 210. As long as it fits into the cartridge, they don't care. Caveat. Now, the smaller or smallest primer, technically, that's commonly available, so that's a bunch of caveats, is 0.175 inches, or 17 caliber. It's about the size of a pellet gun pellet. And the larger primer is almost the same size as, pretty close to a 22 caliber bullet, which is actually 0.223 inches for a 22 long rifle. Now, the rim diameter of, coincidentally, of a rimfire primer based, the rim on a 22 caliber pistol cartridge or rifle cartridge or whatever, the rimfire ones, is 0.278. Now, it's not really close to, but it's in the kind of the range that you would consider the rim diameter or the flange diameter for a 209 shotgun shell primer. So we're seeing numbers that are close, not quite. Now, we see, finally, the largest primer available, 50 BMG, conventional, quote-unquote, is 0.3125. Very close to this range here for the flange diameter or rim diameter for a 209 shotgun shell. So we're looking at ranges in this circle here of your diameters for what is commonly called a primer from 0.175 inches, or 17.5 caliber, if you want to call it that, for the smallest primer, up to, we're going to call it 31 cal, or 0.31 inches for the 50 BMG primer, which represents a lot of the range you see, coincidentally, for if you were to take a 209 shotgun shell primer and stick a BB gun pellet or BB gun, air gun pellet of 17 caliber glued onto this, and try to make a chamber for it, you would eventually end up with a lot of the dimensions that are used here. This is also the reason when people own or have possession of a shotgun shell for 12 gauge and the back end visible for a 50 BMG cartridge, 50 caliber Browning machine gun shell, they notice that it looks a lot like, at least passingly, a shotgun shell and get tempted to stick in a 50 BMG into their shotgun and see what happens. Bad idea. It also brings up the fact that a lot of these companies are using the same drill bits for making the countersinking and flange depths and diameters and depths, the same drill bits in metric or imperial or a compromise between them to form all of these objects by drilling the hole or using the butt end of them to ram a piece of metal on to make this. A lot of these were expediently created in the 1800s forward, and that's where we get them from. We're reusing a lot of dimensions here that were used for some other tool that happened to be on the desk at the time when someone was designing these, including, oddly enough, the 50 BMG, it seems. Just saying. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. And again, all credit goes to Tom Serrato, 2009, in Trap Shooting USA for the 209 shell. Good day.